Sounds good.
So welcome to the Desire Line, and we have another guest this week that we're excited to welcome into the fold. So this is Bob Powers. He's actually Bob is a student of mine, in some ways, and a teacher of mine in other ways, and so really excited to have him on here. He's done a few. He's done a few things over the course of the last year that I think are really interesting. So the one thing that we did a discussion over on my YouTube channel, Historical Fencing Affiliates YouTube channel. That's got to change its name because that organization is now defunct, but the content is still good. But anyway, we did a discussion on tradition, and we did a discussion on commentary tradition specifically, and then this past fall we did Bob came in to the Armatsari event, the off-year sort of WMAW event, and did an excellent lecture that just blew me away on Euclidean epistemology and Fiore and Lichtenauer and Aristotelian epistemology, and I just sort of de facto that, right, because he didn't really talk about it too much, but just juxtaposed with what you're getting from Fiore. So super exciting, super interested in all the craziness that he brings to the table. And after our discussion with Sigmund last week, we had started to kind of get into a little bit of the philosophical weeds, and I thought that this is an opportune time to have Bob on to help set us straight. So
awesome. Yeah, this is my first time meeting you, right, Bob? Is that true?
I was at the wrestling event that you did at James's
awesome.
Club. So
yeah,
that was
before the pandemic. I don't remember anything.
Yeah, right. It's like a different life. Yeah, I really enjoyed your podcast with Sigmund. He was a great guest. So, yeah.
Why don't you tell us about yourself, buddy?
Yeah. So as far as like academic credentials, I'm a PhD candidate at Marquette University. I'm working in medieval philosophy as my area of specialty, specifically Aquinas. So my dissertation theoretically is on the Aristotelian tradition in the problem of universals. So separating that into the ancient problem of universals with Aristotle, the medieval problem of universals with Avicenna and Aquinas, and then comparing that to contemporary Aristotelian conversations on universals. Where that comes into contact with how we look at swords right away is that what we're doing is looking at a specific worldview and a specific tradition that existed, and then we're trying to recreate that tradition today in a different context. And it's similar to what I'm doing professionally in that there's the way that Aristotle looked at the question, and then there's the way that his tradition looked at the question all the way up through the medievals. And then we have a totally different context and a totally different set of questions when it comes to this problem of universals today. And we try and inform that with Aristotle to different levels of success, because the tradition kind of got broken by modernism. So a lot of the problems that we face in HEMA are similar to the problems that I face as a professional philosopher, I guess, whatever that means. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
That's super outside of that, James said I've been doing HEMA with him for several years now. And as far as that goes, I was with Forte Swordplay in Boston prior to that. When I was I did a master's degree at Boston College. And then, prior to that, I was at University of Chicago. I was interested in, but didn't end up joining up with the Chicago Swordplay Guild, mostly because it was financially prohibitive for me as a broke college student. So
right. Yeah.
that's the short version.
Gotcha.
So yeah. So there's a bunch of different questions that I want to ask, but and a bunch of different lines that we could take this. I have like what's like interesting to me right now, like at any given point in my life, I have a thing that is like all consuming. And I don't know if that's true for y'all, but
have you met me?
yeah, right. I do. But I don't know. What I really mean is I know exactly that that's true. At least you. I don't know if that's true about Bob. Actually, that's an interesting question. Bob, do you get completely obsessed with a topic and like schedule your day around that thing for like several weeks or months at a time?
It's interesting. I don't know how things grab hold of me, but they do. But I'm not like obsessive about things. It's a weird phenomenon that it tends to happen among philosophers, that they have like a weird combination of OCD and ADD. That we just jump from topic to topic, but like we dive really deeply into the topics. So it's hard to say like why things hold my attention and like for how long. So I have a tendency to have like about 12 questions that are percolating the back of my mind, only one of which I can address at any given moment. But then like something will pop up and it'll be like, oh, I've been thinking about that question for like a year and I'm, trying to figure out whatever. So I don't know, as of like right this second, what have I been thinking about and working on? I don't know. I'd have to think about what I'm thinking about, like, to answer that question.
Love that you have 12 questions specifically, because you could have chosen any number and you picked that one.
It's just enough to be too much, right? Like if
Right.
it was 3, maybe you could manage it, but like 12 is way too many. So you pick like 3 at a time and the other 9 go on the back burner. And then but they're always nagging at you. Something will pop up in your life and you'll be like, oh, that reminds me of this thing that I've been thinking about like forever.
So yeah. I did want to, because I think this will help direct the conversation where I want to take it, which is what I'm interested in.
Perfect. No, that's great.
But I think at the wrestling seminar, I had you give your a version of your tree talk, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things that I was trying to achieve with that was to get Bob to be in a room when you gave your tree talk, because Bob is because it was exactly the kind of material that would have been super interesting for someone with his background, and he hadn't really been exposed to too much of what was going on intellectually in historical fencing, right? So, or at least I don't want to speak for you, Bob, but I think that's the way I understand. I've known you for quite a while.
For how much I think about this stuff, I'm really outside of the lit. I'm not engaged in any of the forums and things like that. So I come at it with a weirdly outsider perspective, considering I've been doing this for years and years. So.
Right. And so I knew that, and I knew that what Jesse had to offer was super was relevant to your understanding of the medieval mindset, right? And I grabbed you afterwards, and I was like, so I'm really interested in what you have to think about that. And then you gave me your sort of account. I don't know if you recall how things were sitting with you in that moment, but like share a little bit about what your perspective was after you experienced that.
I'm going to briefly say I'm incredibly nervous for this, but go, Bob.
No, it's okay. I'm a little called out because I don't recall.
Good.
Yeah, right. It was very good. It was very interesting, and I remember some of the broad strokes, things about memory and organization, in the medieval mind. One of the things that has been striking me, like when you guys did the mini Zettel podcast, where you went through, it struck me the way that the groupings tended to be important, even just in the mini zettel. Like they tended to be complementary groups, and I one thing that struck me as cool was the grouping of the three with Nachreisen, Oberlaufen, and Aufsetzen. That three is a good number, not just because three is an easy number to remember, and there's Trinitarian things and all kinds of poetry and things like that embedded in the number of three, but it's a good sort of metaphysical number because it's a good number for completeness. It takes at least three of something to represent all the categories you need to explain something. And one of the questions that I had been interested in from a HEMA perspective is why 5 words? Why not 3? So James has given his talk on strong and weak and indes, and it seems at first blush like 3 is a good solid number that you can explain things in terms of strong, weak, and indes, at least the way James presents it. I'm a fan of that. But it's not 3, it's 5. And so the question is why 5 and not 3? At least to my, this is how I think about things, I guess. Why 5 and not 3? And to me, it connects back to the idea of modus in 3227a Dobringer, and then back to Aristotle, and the whole that opens up a whole can of worms about Plato and change in metaphysics, and Plato's 5 genera, which is, so you need 5 things to explain change in the Greek mind. But anyway,
man,
I have no idea where to go.
Anyway,
no.
Yeah,
no.
we're like, what are you doing? You have to keep talking now.
You don't get to stop. Like that's not how that works.
You can't say that and be like, yeah. So something about I don't know. You need 5 things for change or some, okay. So.
Yeah, all right. Yeah. So in Dobringer, in the 3227a, he talks about Fulin and indes being explained by modus, and modus is a term he uses in Latin, so it's a technical term. So the question becomes why modus? What's he talking about with modus, and why use the Latin? And obviously that is change. Sometimes we translate it as motion, but motion's not quite right, because in Aristotelian physics, motion, modus, can be local motion, which is change in place, or it can be change in quality. There's one more that I can't remember, but it's better translated as change than it is translated as motion, and that's actually a pretty big insight that the community kind of needs to get their head around. But fundamentally, for Aristotle, change is the reduction of a potency to an actuality. So if you have some potential, you reduce the number of potentials into one actuality. So I'm talking on this podcast. That's what I'm actually doing. I'm potentially doing a million things, but I reduce the millions of things that I could be doing to one actuality, which is talking to you guys and explaining modus. So all changes are reductions of potentiality to actuality. So if I go from talking on this podcast to walking out in a huff or something like that, I've activated one of the potentialities and made it actual.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So this question, that whole basket of things is embedded in another tradition of questions that comes from Plato in the Sophist, thinking about Parmenides and Heraclitus, talking about change and how change is possible while things can still be true. So Aristotle's trying to solve for that problem, and Plato describes it as a theomachy, a battle between the gods and the giants, where the giants are trying to constantly take the gods down into the material world, and the gods are constantly trying to reach down from the heavens to the material world. So there's this inability to meet in the middle between truth claims and empirical reality. So from a Parmenidean perspective, being can't change because truth can't change. So once something is true, and this is sort of the absolute sense of true, once something is true, it can't be untrue. And similarly, being correspondingly, once something is true, it is. And so how do you explain something going from being to not being? And furthermore, how do you do that without contradicting it?
Right.
Because a thing that is not isn't. So like, how do you talk about something that isn't without talking falsely? And then from the giant's perspective, you live in a world that's constantly in flux, that's constantly changing. So it seems at first glance that nothing can be true, which is actually funny because it seems to me like you guys talk about truth and the possibility of like absolute truth pretty often on this podcast. So it's interesting that all these conversations just fall right into line.
Yeah.
But in the Sophist, Plato posits that you need 5 genera in order to explain change without talking falsely about non-being. So he has being, motion, rest. So being, change, and staying the same. Being, motion, rest, similarity, and difference. And you need at least those 5 things, according to Plato's mind, to explain to explain change without talking about non-being. Without talking about non-being as though it's a category that exists. And obviously there's other ways of doing metaphysics and things like that. But it was interesting to me that you need 5 things to explain change in the Greek tradition. And then in the medieval fencing tradition, you need 5 things to explain change. And then feeling is the ability to perceive the change. And indes is acting in the change. And then strong, weak, before, after, all those things fall out.
Right. Awesome. Okay. So that was brilliant. And it totally derailed what I wanted to do, but that's okay. That's like, that's been something that we've been talking about for a while. And I know that you've been putting together a more elaborate sort of presentation of those ideas that, you're not going to just give a pithy summation in a podcast. Right. But I'm really excited to hear more on that. I want to give Jesse an opportunity to talk through that a little bit. I have to run, but I still have you. I'm listening, so keep talking. And then I want to talk about a little bit about your project as it relates to tradition. And that's something that we were talking about last week that I want to kind of get to. But before I do, let's hear some rousing discussion.
Oh man, well, this is a new presentation of pieces that I've run into, because of course, like I'm not academically trained in this stuff, right? Like I'm just a lay person and I just read a lot of books. And so like I have strangely specific and detailed knowledge in certain areas, and then just giant gaping holes in my knowledge that I run into. So, similarity and difference, that really, like, that's where I, if people are watching this, you saw me light up. Because boy, like that idea is being really important to understanding a way to break down fencing actions was one of the things that I ran across, and it really, really stuck with me. And I was looking at it as related to memory traditions, right? Using similarity and difference for the purpose of remembering a thing. But could you go into a little bit more about how that applies to understanding change or being or all of that?
Yeah. So the way I teach it to my students is we play a game where we try and explain how something can change without ever saying the word is not. So it's kind of like that's the thought experiment, is explain change without using the word not. Because if you use the word not, you're talking about non-being. So where it gets to eventually along the course of the game is that when you talk about the relationship between being and being at rest, you can say like, well, being is the same as being at rest if you're one of the gods, but being is the same as being in motion if you're one of the giants, right? So if you're living in this world, being is always changing, but if you're committed to an idea of truth as being something eternal, then being is unchanging, it's at rest. And so then you have to figure out, well, how do you relate rest and motion without saying rest is not motion? Like rest is the opposite of motion. Like what can you introduce in order to do that? And the solution that Plato comes up with is that rest is the same as being at rest, and rest is different than being in motion. And so, and then the same thing the other way. Being in motion is the same as being in motion, and being in motion is different than being at rest. And then being is the same as being at rest, whereas like being is different than being in motion, and all those sorts of things. Anyway, you can fill out a whole category with that. But I agree with you too that it's definitely has to do with the way that human beings think and remember things. So going back to the tree and the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, thinking, like I'm geeking so hard. Yeah, no, that's freaking great. All right. Well, I'm gonna have to start thinking about rest and change a lot more. So I'm gonna break the rule already, but then in this definition, is rest unchanging?
Right. Exactly. So yeah, you broke the rules, so you're out. Right. You can't. That doesn't count. So, well, how did you phrase the question? Is rest
not unchanging, right?
Unchanging.
The opposite of, yeah.
Right.
Is
it would have to be different than change. Yeah. It would have to be different.
Stability. Maybe. Could it be stable and unstable like Fiore?
Well, okay. No. You.
Nope.
No. Everyone's already heard everything that I have to say about everything. Keep talking. Answer the question, Bob.
Oh, I'm not.
All right. Well, all right. So let's do this. Let's do this. So we are gonna table this because we could totally do this like for the next hour and accomplish nothing, and then continue doing this.
That's not true.
Nothing. No, that you're right. So we would accomplish a great deal, and we would all be very, very happy, or at least I would be very happy walking away from what we've done. But I do want to talk about the line of discussion, or I want to sort of intercept the line of discussion that we've been on for over the course of the past few podcasts, right?
Okay.
And because Bob has really, really interesting insights about tradition, right? And so I've been really interested in tradition lately, right? Because it's sort of existential for me. Right? What the hell am I doing? And sort of like, why is what I'm doing important to me, right? And so I've approached historical fencing from a very modern perspective, right? Over the course of the last going on 13 or so years that I've been doing this, which is that we think of, or I thought of what I was learning from the texts to be, or I thought of, the project that I was engaged in is sort of an attempt to better understand what I was getting from the text, or what I was seeing in the texts, right? Have an increased understanding of what it was to fence, or what it was to be a martial artist in the medieval and Renaissance periods, right? And I've thought of that. That's been the driving sort of force of my practice, right? It's the way that I informed my practice. It's the way that I informed my striving, right? And I've recently, like in the last year or 2 years, have been taking a different approach to what I'm doing, right? Which is that it's not as important to me to try and, well, so I don't want to say that either, right? I don't want to say that it's not important for me to try and get in the head of the people that I'm studying, but I feel like I'm more a part of it than I was. Like I used to think that I was like looking at something that that's there, that's different, and I want to get like inside of this, or or not get inside of it, but just to have a perspective of it, right? To like be able to tell you the kind of the truth of it, right? Or hope to get as close to the truth of that thing as I can. And it strikes me that that's a very modern way to look at that knowledge, right? So we have science now, and science is like the ongoing discussion of the truth of the world or whatever, right? And and there is no, I mean, you could say in a sense that science is a tradition in and of itself, right? But that's not really the way that we look at it. We look at like what we're getting from science is facts, right? Like those are the facts of the world. And it's not really important where they came from or how they're framed or whatever, right? Like it's just important if we can empirically demonstrate their truth, right? Like that's what's important about the truth that we get from science. And it strikes me that tradition is a different way of passing down knowledge, right? Like tradition is its own framework for transmission of knowledge, across time. And I arrived there from listening to Bob talk about the way that he approaches philosophy, right? And I think the way that the medieval mind approached philosophy, right? So, and this is sort of calls back to the discussion we were having with Sigmund. But I want to hear you talk a little bit about that, Bob, like, and what your role is or what your goal is with your study of medieval philosophy, right? So are you trying to like understand it on their terms? Are you trying to answer your own, those types of questions? So if you could flesh that out a bit.
Yeah, there's an interesting parallel, like I was saying before, between some of the problems we run into and the problems I run into in philosophy. And it starts out with, even the history of studying Aquinas in the modern age has its own, it's actually has a lot of parallels to Hema once it strikes you. It began with a papal encyclical called Aeterni Patris, where the Pope called for philosophers in the Catholic Church to start studying Catholic philosophical tradition, specifically in terms of Aquinas. So scholasticism had sort of fallen by the wayside as a serious philosophical school, and the Pope wanted a Catholic philosophy. So he's like, all right, everybody start reading Aquinas. And so you had all these philosophers in the 18th, 19th century, or I'm sorry, 19th, 20th century, reopen all these old scholastic books. And now they were like, well, now what do we do? Right. And so the question for them became like, okay, yeah, what do we do? Are we trying to reestablish this as a viable philosophy? Are we trying to just understand it as a text? Are we trying to understand it as a text in a context? Are we trying to use their insights to help us solve contemporary problems? These are just 4 quick examples of like how you could approach a restoration of an old text. And then we do the same thing in Hema. We say like, okay, are we trying to reproduce what they said in the text, or are we trying to understand the text as part of a tradition of texts, or understand it as part of a medieval phenomenon embedded in its history, or are we trying to, recreate it to create a modern game out of something that we can do with our friends, or
Right.
Or what exactly is the goal? And so I described to you guys kind of briefly the project that I've undertaken as my dissertation, and it's similar in that vein. So you have these ancient problems that Aristotle and Plato were concerned with, and then you have this Neoplatonic tradition, and you have a parallel tradition of largely Arabic language commentaries on Aristotle that are furthering the questions that the ancients asked. So in the case of the problem of universals, it began as a problem of definitions, and became a problem of species and difference and genus. How do you define something? You define it by genus and a specific difference. And so, like, what are those things and how do they relate to words and universals? And then it became a problem of essences. So you have this commentary tradition on Aristotle, where Aristotle writes a book, and then Porphyry writes the Isagoge, and then Ammonius writes a commentary on that, and then Boethius writes a commentary on that. And so you're adding these layers to the commentary.
Mhm.
Every time somebody writes a commentary, they're addressing problems that are in the text, but they're furthering the problem according to how it was addressed by the previous commentators, all the way until the problem morphs into a medieval problem of universals and essences. So what is
Right.
it? What is it to be a thing, to have an essence, and to describe that essence as a universal? And then there's a break in the tradition, and you get Russell and Moore in contemporary context in England trying to answer problems of universals using like this new Phrygian semantics and existential and universal modifiers and things like that. And then so one thing that we do possibly mistakenly is we go back to the text of Aristotle and we think, well, how did Aristotle think about universals, to try and answer the problem of how did Russell and Moore think about universals? And that might be a misapplication because they're trying to answer a different set of questions, and they're running in a parallel in a different tradition. And so and then the question becomes the same as the question we have in HEMA: how much of this is our baggage, and how much of this did they actually think about, and things like that. So when we're thinking about what it means to belong to a tradition and what it means to be doing HEMA in the contemporary context, one of the things that comes out when you're looking at these ancient traditions, and the fact that what the fellowship was doing was a commentary tradition on the Zettel, that what they were doing was adding to the Zettel through their explanations and furthering the problems and furthering the game along and adding to the theory and things like that. And that can serve as a limiting, so in a tradition that serves as a limiting principle, but it also serves as a springboard. So when you're writing a commentary, you're forced to address the things that were addressed. The recital is the kind of schedule, like, right? It's the topics that you're going to address when you're doing a commentary. At some point,
Yeah.
Nachreichen's going to come up. At some point, like, you have to hit these marks. But from that, it's also a springboard. So when you're talking about Nachreich, maybe you give the same play that the previous commentator gave, but maybe you change it a little, or maybe you give a slightly different play, or maybe you put Nachreich in a different section to illuminate something new about it. So thinking about ourselves, we can be doing any number of these projects, but one thing we could be trying to do is furthering the tradition by using it as both the limiting principle and a springboard. And that's where we can sort of give ourselves permission to, on the one hand, be faithful to the tradition the way that we see it, and allow ourselves to embed ourselves in the history and in what they were doing as the problems progressed for them, but also free ourselves, on the other hand, to add to the tradition, to expand on it, to think about them in modern idiom.
Maybe because you said, okay, you want to go?
Yeah.
Okay, go. So I just want to say maybe we're not. So I think this question of whether or not our insights are new or undiscovered, right? So that is an interesting thing to think about, like how we should frame our insights, right? Whether or not we're contributing or we're discovering a new aspect of the truth of what has been passed on to us, right? And but we can table that. So go ahead, Jesse.
Well, so like two specific examples stood out to me. I think probably the one that's the most accessible for anyone, especially given recent scholarship into this, is if we're looking at Lecushner, for instance, right, who wrote a gigantic Messer treatise. He clearly was working off of a copy of Lev, or what we consider to be a copy of Lev, right? And Lev seems to be a slightly later version of another thing. But that interaction between Lekushner and Lev is, to me, the most clear example where there's a clear building upon, right? That he took the zettel, the recital, and not only kept it, but then expanded into it, and then took Lev's commentary on what we consider to be the Zadel, and then built on that as well. So he kind of built on both pieces, which is rather fascinating, I think. And so I wonder how that applies to, like, you know, what you're saying here.
Well, I think it's, I mean, on the surface level, it's illuminating for us to think about these people as being in conversation with each other, and think about them as themselves developing. That so the medieval commentators tended to be really conservative in their attribution. So where we emphasize originality, and you guys have talked a lot about our emphasis on originality and interpretations. The medieval mind was the opposite. They wanted anything that they thought that was new to be attributable to the source. So it was very important that any new insight that they came up with was so rooted in the principles of the source material that it could be attributed to the author of the source. So it would not surprise me to hear Lekuchner say, this is all Lichtenauer. Nothing new here, even though you can tell there's new stuff. Whereas we're sort of the opposite. So on the surface level, it doesn't surprise me in that regard. And then it wouldn't amaze me to find out that he was adding even to Lichtenauer, like, and just saying, like, oh, there's this part of the Zettel that we didn't know about until, you know, it was discovered or something. I don't know. I'm not in Lekuchner enough to comment intelligently on that. But then, from our perspective, there's a question of approach that we can allow ourselves to ask, which is, are we modeling ourselves off of them in that they do swords, but doing it in our own way, insofar as we're like, no, we're gonna do the science way that James was talking about earlier in the podcast, or are we gonna model ourselves off of them, not only in how they do swordsmanship, but in how they think about tradition and how they think about doing swordsmanship. So, like, are we going to be like the Lekuchner just in his Messer actions, or are we going to be like the Lekuchner in his approach to tradition and his approach to Lichtenauer in sort of metaphilosophical way?
Yeah, and it strikes me in what you're saying that, like, we have this really fucked up and opposing, right? We have this fucked up and like literally at odds with one another approach that we want to say, this is my interpretation of exactly Lichtenauer.
Right.
Rather than just committing to, like, one or the other, you know?
So there's a couple of things that we could wonder, right, from this. It's like, one, what is the utility of approaching knowledge, right? Approaching the sort of development, the transmission and the development of knowledge in this paradigm, in this tradition paradigm. And by that, I mean, like, or to specifically talk about what I'm, or to kind of give specific examples of the features of this paradigm, right? We can say, like, this particular feature that Bob just brought up about everything that we contribute is undiscovered truth embedded within the stuff that's been passed on, right? So, like, that would be an aspect of this paradigm that we've abandoned, right? So what is the utility of that way of engaging with knowledge, right? Engaging with truth, as compared to sort of a more modern like analytic and or like scientific approach to, or a historiographical approach to like engaging with this stuff, right? So like, well, does that make sense?
We're already in a place where there's going to be a set of preconceptions, though. So by utility, we could have a preconceived notion of like utility in the scientific endeavor, right? Where we say like, well, what's the utility? Meaning, what truths are we going to get out of this? What facts are we going to be able to attain that we can apply directly to our swordsmanship by using this model over that model? So there's already an interesting set of preconceptions that I don't know if you're suggesting, but might come along with that notion of utility for someone who's listening, right? So like there's that side where you could say like, okay, well maybe there's a way in which it will benefit us as interpreters and swordsmen in the modern context to look at it that way, because we can attain new insights into what they were doing. But there's also, I think, a lot that can be said about. So you guys did that podcast with Charles Lynn, right? About tradition and what was it, like elder statesman in HEMA or something like that? How do you become an elder in HEMA? If you're, I mean, one possible thing for consideration is if you're embedding yourself in a tradition, then there's going to be like we already have parallel running traditions of contemporary HEMA and the medieval phenomenon that we're studying, right? But if we can try and link those two up, maybe there's going to be a place, and with an emphasis on innovation with fidelity as opposed to like innovation with rejection. There might be some fertile area for us to think about how we're going to treat the elder statesman. Like my way of thinking about the 5 words is sort of inevitably informed by James because I'm his student, and it meshes really well with other things that I think about medieval philosophy and Aristotle, as I sort of started to explain earlier. So anything that I'm going to add to that is going to be in part attributable to the insights that James gave to me early on in my training relationship to him. So what does that mean for my innovations and my rejection of James? There's going to be this similar dichotomy where I can say that I owe to his insights the springboard and also the limiting principle, inevitably, because I'm going to accept some preconceptions, but also then I have these innovations that are based on those principles that maybe are corrections of other things that he thought or whatever,
or refinements, right?
Or refinements, yeah. And that's going to inform the way that I treat James in the sense of like, now, not only do I belong to a Leichnauer tradition, I also maybe belong to a Riley tradition. I don't know. And then, whereas instead of trying to make a name for myself by saying like, this is where everybody got it wrong prior to me, I could potentially, these are 2 options that I would have. I could make a name for myself by saying I'm a continuation. So if James was right about these sets of insights, then I can add this further information to that set of insights.
So I'm sorry. So I think it's really interesting because what you're suggesting is that, when we look at the text, right, we don't treat things that we might qualify as being wrong, right? We don't like treat those things as being wrong. We never say that the historical masters were just not right. We always assume that they understood everything perfectly true, right? And that, they were unclear, or this is how we can make sense of what they were saying in these cases, right? And the truth is, like the real truth, right, is that we can't know, and B, if we were to guess, we'd probably say that they just weren't thinking as clearly in these realms as we are in this moment, right? Like we're allowed to say like they probably didn't think too much about that, right? We're probably taking this thing deeper than they are. And that gets me to that gets me to start thinking about like the sort of the nature of understanding, and how like we're not bots, right? Like we have some knowledge, right? But what makes humans really, really great is that they can take little bits and pieces of knowledge, and those conceptions can work synergistically to help us answer complex questions where there's no logical coherency, right? Like we're not, does that make sense? Like we can answer these super complex questions, but not
Right.
be able to take you through this sort of super logical, analytic, like step-by-step way of how we figured out that was the correct answer, right? That's just part of our nature, and that's why I don't know who said it, but the Bobby Fischer thing about how there were no masters in chess anymore because they had solved chess, right? So they had solved chess, they had figured it out, they programmed the logarithms, and the computer can do it now. And so Bobby Fischer was like, well, now it's just, but the point is, if we had all of the logical sort of the logical path to answering all the complex questions that humans answer on a regular basis, that would be something different than what we do, right? So you can have some set of conceptions that that are all you need to answer complex questions, and maybe not develop them, ultimately, so that you can prove how your answer is correct, right? And so maybe when we're looking at these historical masters, right, we're just saying like they obviously knew the truth of whatever fencing or like the, but it's okay to say that they hadn't developed it so that they could articulate all of the ways in which what they understood was true. Is that you guys following me on this?
Oh yeah.
Right, Bob, I'm curious what you have to say about the guys.
Yeah, I'm following it in part.
Okay.
There are other parts I'm like not quite sure what you're saying, but I can make parallels in, so like even in Aquinas, and I can't remember, there's some Marian issue that is sort of outside of my field because that's theological, not philosophical, but I think it might be the Immaculate Conception that he actually, the position that he takes in the Summa is different than the position that the church takes today. And so the question for a Catholic person would be like, well, what do I do with that? Like, how could Aquinas have been wrong if he's, the doctor of the church and all this stuff? And what you do if you're embedded in a tradition is you say, okay, well, this particular problem, he got it wrong, but I can explain why he got it wrong using his own principles. And so you kind of save Aquinas from himself. You say like, okay, well, based on these other things that Aquinas thinks, I could see where he went wrong here and where he should have arrived at the right answer here. And you can kind of do that. Like if you see something in a treatise that you're like, well, that doesn't seem to be the optimal solution. I think this other thing is the optimal solution. If you can explain that using the language of Lichtenauer, using the paradigms of Lichtenauer, then you can say like, okay, well, within the system, this is what, I can say that they were wrong if I want to, but I don't have to. I can say that like, they were right in their understanding of fencing, and this is what they should have thought. Like it's almost more Aristotle than Aristotle, or more Lichtenauer than Lichtenauer.
I mean, one thing that keeps popping up in my mind is in the von Danzig treatise in the section on Abschneiden. They stick like Schnappen and another physical motion in there, but Schnappen is named and most people know what that is. Yeah. The author of that made that slicing off, right? Whereas none of the other authors do. The other authors group that in another section of the manuscript, right? Another broader category. And so I find that particular inclusion fascinating from what you're talking about, because I know a lot of people have, basically say, oh, well, that's wrong. That's not Abschneiden, right? Okay, that's one perspective one could take. And I'm like, this is all for memory. And so it's a punny little thing where you're slicing off of the sword rather than slicing off the opponent's arms. And it's a fun, easy way to think about it because they kind of use that language, right? Slice off the sword. And so, and I mean, who cares who's right? But I think that highlights kind of these different approaches that you're talking about, Bob, with regards to approaching these materials. You know, what do we say about the author of Von Danzig? Were they wrong? Were they making a pun? Was it something else entirely? Does it matter? You know?
Right.
Yeah, that's one thing I really I like about your approach, Jess. That the poetry and that, like, the reveling in the ambiguity of things. I think that's a fundamental aspect of poetry that, like, just needs to be embraced.
I love it.
I mean, this is one thing that I do remember from us having a conversation after the wrestling thing was the Alber versets thing, the fool sets aside or whatever. It's like, yeah, it's all of the things that it says it is. Like, it's great.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
revel in the ambiguity in that case. And yeah, so, like, then there's an open question that, like, you know, okay, so is it ambiguous on purpose or is it ambiguous on accident? It's like, okay, yeah, I mean, we don't know. In the case of what you just described, like, okay, did he just misspeak? Was it copied wrong? Did he misunderstand something? Like, those are all possibilities. But I also admire the approach of reveling in the ambiguity. So, like,
Yeah,
well, you know,
I think you know, we say does this mean this or does it mean that, right? And I think that for me, that's like a fundamentally incorrect approach. Like, that's the wrong question, right? Like, that's like not what this stuff is for. To, you know what I mean? Like, this stuff is to be there for us to think about. That's why it exists. Like, that's my perspective, right? So, like, when we say, well, what is he really trying to tell us here? My perspective is he's trying to tell us everything. He's trying to tell us all the things. Like, he says this thing, and then it's for to be there to ponder, right? And to give us a springboard, right, to develop our own understanding of the insights embedded within the text. Right? That's sort of the way that I go ahead.
Right, but you have to have the thing to ponder, right?
For sure.
So it's a non-starter to say it's the wrong question to ponder because the point is to have the question.
Fair, right.
I mean, to me.
Right, I guess. Yeah. So, okay. I
because
think
that's always where I am. I always want to be able to answer the ultimate true question of what did Lichtenauer think? It doesn't matter that it's unknowable. I accept that it's unknowable.
Yeah. So when I don't think of it as what did they think, right? That's and so it's just a different, like, I think of it as what is true, right? So, like, I think that Lichtenauer understood the universal truth of the world, right?
Correct. So knowing his thought would therefore be.
Sure. I guess, yeah, sure. I think that when someone says something, and that if they are correct in what they're saying, then there is a tremendous degree of precision in their language, and it means all of the things that it means, and it doesn't mean all of the things that it doesn't mean, right? So we could spend.
Man. This is why we're friends. This is why I think the opposite. I think precision is the way to falsehood.
All right.
I feel you. I feel you because you often, as your friend, and I've seen you do this, achieve precision through ambiguity.
Sure. Right. For sure. Totally.
Right.
Totally. And so like, and that's kind of that's what I'm getting at, is that in order to be precise, right, you can't, in order to be precise and be bulletproof, right, like to cover your bases, right, to anticipate objections, you have to be very careful with what you're saying. And what I see, I was actually going to text you yesterday. I was engaged in a discussion that I was just like, this is something I probably need to share. But it was just like, okay, this is for maybe later. Right? I hate that people. Is there a way to formulate a proposition that doesn't come off to people as though I'm inviting them to pull me into their drama? I wonder. That's gonna leave it there.
No.
Right. Exactly. No. There's no way you can say anything that doesn't indicate to people who are animated that you're trying to take them on. Right? Even
Right.
And regardless of how ambiguous or how laconic you can be in your word choice.
So
no, I'm gonna just to call back to like our bell hooks episode, I am gonna say there is a way to do it, and it requires a ton of softening language until your proposition no longer stands. So it's done, and it's done by women all the time. But we get socialized into it, and I don't know that it's a positive. So there's that.
Oh, yeah, I think that's really insightful. All right, go ahead, Bob. You were going to say something.
Oh, just to call back to the idea of ambiguity. Ambiguity can be, I would say ambiguity can be vicious or it can be virtuous. And there's a way in which people that don't know what they're talking about are ambiguous sort of deliberately to muddy the waters. And that's what I think of as sophistry. So when I teach the sophist, which is where I'm getting all the Parmenidean metaphysics stuff from, that's what I think Plato ultimately concludes about sophistry, is that it's muddying the waters for the sake of muddying the waters. And then there's a kind of precision where you're trying to be as meticulous in your language as possible to try and capture the phenomenon. And then there are phenomena that can't be captured with that level of precision, that require an ambiguity in order to capture it. And so that's kind of a precise ambiguity, and that might be a level of where poetry is at. And that's why I think that thinking about the Zettel in terms of poetry and reveling in the ambiguity is a good thing. So there's levels to it, and you might expect that from a philosophical background and stuff like that I'd be into the precision camp, but I definitely appreciate that there are two ways of capturing the phenomenon. Depending on what the phenomenon is, it might be better captured through ambiguity. And yeah, I gave my favorite example from the Zettel. I think the Albert Versetzen is the classic example. But
yeah, for sure. And I'm even being inspired to think about James and I's frequent conversations about artistry versus a scientific approach, perhaps. I mean, that just ends up being the way we talk about it. But I find myself compelled frequently by flashes of insight, which I recognize is amateurish, but it feels like that's a great place to start. And from there, then you backfill, right, with your logic. You backfill with the pieces that make sense. Yeah. But in my experience, I very frequently build the other way. Or that there's a push and pull. I don't know. What do you think from where you are, Bob? Does that happen?
Well, from a historical perspective, it is philosophy emerges from mythology. So you start out with myths. Plato, even Plato himself, he was a wrestler and a soldier, and then he wanted to write poetry. He wanted to write plays, and I think it was Parmenides that he heard Parmenides speak, and then he heard Socrates speak, and after he heard Socrates, he ripped up all his plays and was like, I gotta this is what I got to do for the rest of my life now, is follow this guy around. And so when he wrote in two genres, but the only genre we have left of his is dialogue. So, and what's dialogue? Dialogue is a story, it's a narrative, and embedded in the narrative is philosophy. And so dialogues were invitations to come and hear him speak at the academy. They were like his advertising campaign. He'd send out dialogues to be read in public, and then people would think about them, and then come to hear him speak at the academy. So even from a historical perspective, philosophy, as we think about it today, is that precise, like, precision in your language, precision in your logic, that emerges from the ambiguity of mythology. And I think that there's a way in which human beings, it might be a psychological thing, so I'm pushing the boundaries of my competency, but there's a way in which we need to think in terms of poetry before we can think in terms of philosophy. And so you take something that you're looking at a phenomenon, the best thing you can do is make a metaphor or make an analogy, and then you use the poetry of the metaphor or the imprecision of the analogy to inform a more precise articulation of the problem.
Yeah.
And then maybe from there you can go backward the other way too and say, like, well, okay, well, I captured a good deal of the phenomenon in that attempt, but I need to go back to a more poetic or mythological or metaphorical or whatever you want to say way of expressing this, because I didn't capture everything I needed to capture. Mm-hmm. And then so as far as the push and pull, that would make sense to my mind.
Right. And like the way I've found that in my own working with this stuff, right, was like, I'm working to understand the tree. Then I went through that proofing, I guess one would say, of understanding the logic behind it. Then had a flash of intuition that perhaps it applied to, the longsword section. So then I did apply it, right? So, and then and now I work backwards the other way. Well, since I did apply it, now what can I build out of that? Mm-hmm. Right. And like, the idea of proofing kind of stuck with me. Like, it reminded me of geometry, of taking geometry,
Yeah. That's interesting. So I think there's a relevant aspect of what we do as a physical practice, right? As a and that a lot of us as actors in this practice bring various sets of physical competencies, right? And so like there are people who, so we've been treating this sort of almost purely intellectual, right? Like, so like the whole project of connecting these things. But also there are people who bring their physical competencies to the table and understand truths, even if they can't articulate those truths, right? Through their embodied practice, right? So like they, and then what they do is they are backfilling, right? So they're backfilling the truth of the text, right? Or they're connecting the truth of the text to what they understand sort of intuitively, and sometimes that sometimes that works really well, and other times they have to refine, right, their understanding, or maybe you know what I'm saying. So like, but it's often the case that someone who understands fencing, whatever way we want to define fencing, right, understands it in a really deep way, like they embody it in a very deep way, right, and then hear some description of or some articulation of a concept that's contained within the text, and they're like, no, that's not, that's not right. And it's like, well, how do you know it's not right? It's like, I just know that's not right, right? And maybe they haven't done all of the work to like develop this sort of huge framework to like be able to describe all of the features of what they're doing. And then for a lot of people, they don't ever need that ever, right? In their entire practice, they can just come to class on a Tuesday and do their fencing, and and they just kind of a lot of this stuff goes over their head, or maybe they're in an environment where it's just not really talked about very much. And, maybe again, now we're sort of, we're getting to the question of the nature of the utility, right? Like, so like, what the hell are you, what are you doing? That's a personal thing. But I think it's the same. I think it's what we're describing here is like all the same thing about how we arrive at insights, and there's no real way to grab. And I think that's part of the nature of our humanity, right? Is that often there's no real way to ground an insight that we have that we immediately regard as like fundamentally true. Like maybe we have to shore it up a little bit. Maybe we have to just create a little bit of ambiguity so that we can protect, its integrity or whatever. Right. But like, but I think that often we like learn something about the world and we're like, this is clearly true. And if someone really pressed us on it, we'd be like, I just don't know. like that would be the answer. It's like, I can't fucking tell you. I don't like, I know this is, but we never do that as humans. We also like, we have our, our sort of testosterone fueled, like I will
pride,
not,
whatever. Yeah.
I will not be proven wrong.
Well, it's fundamental to any insight is that there's going to be empirical residue. There's going to be things that you didn't take into account. There's going to be things that might disprove the insight, but the insight's too important, so you sort of ignore them. And then there's going to be things that you have not yet applied your insight to. So that's just true. It's just true of the nature of having an insight, coming to know something. And I think that also talking about the people that have their insights in different ways than reading the sources and thinking about it on this high level also gets into your conversation about the nature of HEMA versus the practice of swordsmanship. And HEMA is sort of like a set of methodological tools, and whether or not we can call those people HEMAists who don't apply those methodological tools. And there is a way in which they're having insights into the same practice we're having insights into, and they're embedded in the same tradition that we're embedding ourselves into. If we're thinking about it in like more liberal terms, in terms of like the more medieval mindset, that HEMA might be characterized by a set of methodologies, but the people that aren't engaged in those methodologies are still having insights that are valuable to the practice, whether the practice is swordsmanship or the practice is HEMA.
Well, and that seems inherent to me to be a problem of a physical art, right? It or a mechanical art, I suppose, if we're speaking more, if we're speaking more accurately. Because like, when both of you were speaking about this, like I was starting to think about like woodworkers and like their understanding of the grain of wood, and that they'll just tell you, they'll look at a board and they'll say that board is going to bend. And you go, how do you know that? And they go, I just do. Right. It just will. And they can't articulate it anymore because it's just born out of experience. And maybe they were never told, they just experienced it, and they never had to think about it or justify it or proof it in a way that words got that information to someone else because it was experiential. And so I suspect there's something just inherent to the nature of a mechanical art.
Yeah. So I think I had suggested, I had suggested something similar to Bob, or maybe it was to, I don't remember who I said something like this to, but like the nature of teaching, right? So this is something I've been very interested in as a fencing coach, right? Is like, how do I impart this sort of, wisdom of my experience or whatever? Like, I don't want to be too presumptuous when I'm saying this, but like, right? How do I share what I think I know with people who are interested to hear me talk about it, right? And like, there's a difference between the way that I do that, right, and the way that maybe Bob does that as a teacher in front of a classroom of 30 people or whatever, right? And so maybe part of it is like the preconceptions that we have about knowledge, given the way that we think about education in America in the 21st century, right? So like, we think about knowledge as as something that you get from sitting in a classroom listening to someone who's a teacher and has a curriculum or, you know, like I don't want to say like that's the only way that anyone's ever thought about knowledge in our present, but like that model definitely informs a lot of us and the way that we think about knowledge and the transmission of knowledge and education and stuff. And I think for me, one of the reasons that I've arrived at this conclusion, for lack of a better word, about how it is that I can't really justify sort of a priori what I believe to be true, right? Like I've tried to like get as deep as I could, and what I've discovered is that I just can't justify a priori what I believe to be true, but I nevertheless am committed to the idea that these things are true, right? And so like I think that that's part of the nature of our humanity, that like we just can't absorb the totality of the world. And so then the question becomes, well, how do we, if we're not going to like ground everything that we know or think we know, all the facts of the world scientifically or epistemologically, you know, then how do we decide what's true, and what do we decide is true? And that's sort of where I was leading when I first asked you like about the utility of tradition as a paradigm to right. Does that make sense?
Sure. So it's like a would it be like something like a set of criteria in which that we base like the validity of our conclusions about the
and we have to ground right and so we have to ground our things somehow, and like we live like the perspective that we have today just generally is like we ground it in empiricism and we ground it in like analytic philosophy or like a post-analytic philosophy or whatever, right? But like
I mean, I would, so HEMA in the contemporary context has its own tradition. So it's got a set of criteria that it already works with, which is like, you know, is it found in the sources? Does it work in sparring? You know, can you win a tournament with it? Whatever the heck it is. And I think that among the criteria, at least like, so for my own experience of HEMA and reading the text, among like, I had to add it to the criteria. Does this make sense from an Aristotelian perspective? When you started talking about the 5 words, it was like, oh, okay, so I have to take Dobringer, the 327A, very seriously when he says that modus is fooling is indes. Like when he says that, I have to take that seriously. And so, can I make sense of this from an Aristotelian perspective? Became part of my criteria, and I think that does this fit into the model of tradition? Could definitely be added to our criteria, at least as far as that's concerned. Like, and I use that occasionally. Like there are things that people do and things that people say that I just go like, well, but Lichtenauer says otherwise, and like, and not in the sense of like the techniques they're performing or their interpretation or something like that, but it's like they're just sometimes that, and tradition is one of those times that Lichtenauer emphasizes something and we go, yeah, but that's not important to fencing. And it's like, but Lichtenauer is our source. Why, if he thinks something is important, like you could say, like he begins the Zettel with love God and honor women, and we go, those are dated notions or whatever. It's like, but he began the Zettel with them, and
right.
So I mean, I don't have a solution to that particular problem, but it's just another area in which you say like, okay, well, we take these people as authoritative in their outlook to these things, and then we dismiss them with a kind of a temporal prejudice with these other things, and it's a bizarre mentality, and I think that it's one of those things that we could use at least as a hermeneutic to like, okay, ping that because that's bizarre, and that might be worth looking into. We might be able to gain an insight there, because at the very least it's bizarre and we need to explain why it's bizarre. And maybe it is temporal, like maybe he is a product of his time and we can dismiss that, but maybe also there's something important to it. I think in the case of tradition and Aristotelian physics and that sort of thing, like those two criteria, I think that they need to be added to our criteria. I have added them to mine, and I would suggest other people add it to theirs. You don't have to. I mean, obviously, we're all doing our own thing, but and you know, I also think reveling in the ambiguity is a great one to Jess's point, and I think that if there's something, you know, pre-philosophical, if there's something mythological or metaphorical or something in the poetry, even of love God and honor women, it's like, well, maybe there is something there that we should look at. I don't know what it is, but so as far as what the role of tradition is for our set of criteria that we use to judge whether or not a technique or an interpretation or what have you is successful or meritorious, like, yeah, man, add those to the list. I don't know.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah, I guess so. So, well, why don't you wrap up then? You were quiet for most of this, Jesse.
Y'all had a lot to say. I was listening. I was learning. Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to end, to think about, or at least to begin with the question that we can all ask ourselves is, what are the criteria by which we are judging what we're doing? And that alone is a question, perhaps, that maybe is a new question. You know, we kind of jumped past that to, like, these are the things I'm adding in my wheelhouse when I look at it, but we could maybe take it back and be broader with that. So, this was awesome, Bob. All right, I'm gonna have to, like, not justify, but I'm gonna have to create a number of questions that now
we're definitely gonna have you.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, we're gonna have you on again.
Yeah,
we're definitely gonna have you on again, and we're gonna continue following this path, because I think this is as important a conversation as literally anybody's having, or at least it's probably the most important conversation to me, right? And it has been for quite a while. But it's like this is I think tremendously useful to anyone who's lucky enough to get to hear it. So thank you so much.
Oh, good. I really enjoyed the conversation. This was great.
All right.
Awesome.